So Akshat, are you presenting from Houston, Texas? Where are you right now?
Yeah, in Houston right now.
How's the weather in April at this time?
It's very erratic. I mean, there is just like random cold fronts, and it's supposed to be nice. Like springtime is probably it's supposed to be the best time in Houston, but I mean, except for these like random cold fronts and random rain, yeah, it's always been very erratic. Yeah.
Hi, Akshat.
Hey Hiroshi, nice to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you again.
Thanks for joining.
Sure. Yes.
I don't. What time is it right now for you?
It's 4 a.m. 4 a.m.
Oh wow!
It
Thanks
is
so
early.
much for joining in. Nice to see you.
That's a real commitment to computational imaging, Kawasaki Sensei.
Yeah. Thank you.
And we can go ahead and get started. It's close to 12:05. So thank you everyone for joining this month's Grundfest Memorial Lecture for the month of April. And as always, some beginning notes. We'll try to end around 12:50 to allow for some questions. And if you want to follow along with future talks in this lecture series, you can visit the website on this slide. This lecture series is hosted in remembrance of Professor Warren S. Grundfest, who is a professor or was a professor of bioengineering, electrical engineering, and surgery at UCLA. And Professor Grundfest was a strong advocate of junior scholars, which has inspired this lecture series focus on early stage or early career researchers in computational imaging. I want to thank the co-organizers of this lecture series, Professor Achyuta Kadambi at UCLA, Professor Kitty Bauman at Caltech, and myself and Pradyumna Chari, who are PhD students at UCLA. And lastly, I want to thank the sponsor of the lecture series, Akasha Imaging, which is a computational imaging startup on polarization. Akasha sponsors an inverse honorarium so we can focus on speakers in non-permanent positions like PhD students and postdocs. And with that, I'm excited to introduce this month's speaker, Akshat Dave, who is a final year PhD candidate at the Computational Imaging Lab at Rice. Akshat's research interests are at the intersection of vision, graphics, and imaging. And during his PhD, he has been a visiting researcher at the MIT Media Lab, as well as a research intern at Adobe Research. And today, Akshat will tell us about, or give a talk titled Beyond RGB, Next Generation Cameras for Untangling Light Transport. And I will pass it over to Akshat to tell us more about this.
Thanks, Alin, for the introduction. Yeah. Hello, everyone. In this talk, let's see what these next generation cameras have to offer. So the world around us is composed of all these stunning and informative light interactions. And the way we humans, how we have utilized all this visual information, it has evolved a lot over the past few years. For instance, the way we consume visual content is evolving right from paintings to photographs and now towards immersive three-dimensional mixed reality. Also, the way in which we utilize visual information, that's also getting transformed quite a lot. For example, in the case of driving, from just using our eyes to figure out how to steer the car to using more assistive technologies such as adaptive cruise control, lane assist, and now towards autonomous vehicles. So as these vision technologies have evolved, the tools to capture visual information, basically cameras, but have also evolved alongside. So are the cameras of today enough to serve the purpose for the applications of future? I'm here to talk about why that's not the case, why the cameras of today are not enough to serve all of these applications of future. And why that's the case? Let's look into some open challenges in realizing these visual technologies of the future. So let's first look into AR/VR. To be able to have an immersive three-dimensional visualization of real-world objects, we want to be able to create interactive, controllable digital twins of real-world objects. And to do that, we need to know everything about their visual appearance, right? From the geometry, material properties, and surrounding environment. And doing that just from RGB images is very hard. For instance, let's consider the most extreme case where we just have a single image. Now, every point, every pixel on this image is a function of these complex high-dimensional unknowns like the geometry, material properties, and the environment. So if we look at the case of autonomous navigation and robotics, we would want these artificial, autonomous agents to do better than humans, and we would want them to have a better eyesight than what we humans have. And we would certainly like them to avoid collisions and to figure out threats around blind turns and be able to see behind occluders. But current systems suffer from the same problem as human eyesight. What we see, whatever information is there in our direct line of sight, overpowers everything else. So today in this talk, we'll see how computational imaging comes to the rescue, how we can design computational cameras that can exploit unique properties of light and which show promise in solving all these open challenges in the visual technologies of the future. So in particular, I'll be focusing on three properties. First, we'll look at how polarization of light is a useful and practical cue for decomposing visual appearance. Then we'll look at how we can exploit reflections on glossy objects and turn objects into cameras. Then we'll see how, by capturing the transient, which is the distribution of time of flight of light paths, we can image 3D image objects that are hidden from our line of sight. So first, let's look into polarization. What is this polarization? Why is it really helpful? So as we all know, light is an electromagnetic wave, and polarization quantifies the oscillation of the electric field. So if you look at the light coming from, let's say, this room, a particular light bulb, it would be completely unpolarized. Light would be, the electric field would be oscillating in all random directions. And by applying things such as a polarizer, you can make this light to the electric field to oscillate only in a particular direction. So in this talk, currently in the start, we'll focus on linear polarization. I'll touch upon circular polarization in the end. And there are two ways in which we would look at linear polarization. The first parameterization is using the intensity of light, which is the total number of photons, angle of polarization, which is the direction in which the electric field is oscillating. And the third is the degree of polarization, which is how much portion of the light is polarized, it's oscillating in a particular direction as compared to the one that is oscillating in all random directions. Another characterization we'll use today is Stokes vector. So these are four numbers that for a light ray can define all of its polarization properties. The first number tells us about, again, the intensity, total number of photons. The next two numbers, S1 and S2, talk about the linear polarization in horizontal, vertical directions and along diagonal directions. And the last one measures the circular polarization that we'll ignore for the time being. So the key insight why I think polarization is important in capturing visual appearance is because of these three factors. Polarization strongly depends on material properties, strongly depends on surface normals, and capturing polarization has now become practical. So if you look at appearance of most of the day-to-day objects, we can decompose that appearance into two parts. First part corresponds to the diffuse component, which imparts the color to this object, which is essentially this light that goes into this object, undergoes multiple scattering, and then comes out. And the other part corresponds to the specular reflection or the specular highlight, which is the light that just directly bounces off of the surface. Turns out these two components have very different polarization properties. So let's start with the case when the lighting is completely polarized. So in this case, when this completely polarized light hits the object, for the diffuse component, because of subsurface scattering, this light becomes completely unpolarized. But then when this light exits the object, Due to this phenomena of like Fresnel transmission, different components of light undergo different transmission, and which results in partial polarization. For the specular part, since it's just like direct mirror reflections, if your light incident is polarized, it remains completely polarized. So diffuse is partially polarized, and a specular is completely polarized. Now, what happens when the illumination is not coming from a polarized source, but like let's say in a room when it is completely unpolarized? Turns out something similar happens even in that case. And to understand that, let's look at these renderings of a glossy sphere under unpolarized room kind of lighting. As before, we can separate the appearance of this object into two parts, diffuse and specular. And if you look at the polarization properties, as before, specular looks much more polarized than diffuse, as seen from the degree of polarization. And also, you would see that the amount of polarization keeps on increasing towards the edges. As the surface becomes more and more oblique, the object becomes more polarized in the case of diffuse. For the specular, as we keep on increasing the obliqueness, the object becomes more and more polarized up to a certain point, which is called as Brewster's angle, at which all the light exiting the object is completely polarized, and after which the polarization decreases. So the degree depends on the elevation angle of the surface. Now the angle of polarization does something different. So if you look at the angle of polarization, you would see that it is orthogonal for diffuse and specular components, where diffuse is 0, specular is pi by 2. And also the angle goes from 0 to pi, like completes the full circle in both these cases, because it depends on azimuth angle, and for a sphere, azimuth angle goes all around the circle. So the degree depends on elevation angle of normals, angle depends on azimuth angle. So both depend on surface normals, and we saw that diffuse and specular components have different polarization properties. So it seems like a useful cue, and how do we go ahead and capture it? So the conventional way of capturing polarization involves taking a polarizer and rotating it in front of the camera. So when you rotate a polarizer in front of the camera, you would see this sinusoidal variation. Sorry, there's some issue with the video. 1 second. Let me try to fix the issues with the video, because it will show up in the later slides as well. Sorry. I don't know why PowerPoint does this sometimes on me, that it'll stop deciding to stop playing videos. Just a second. Let me try to just restart. So yeah, seems like it wants to work now. So let's see. Yeah. So basically, by rotating a polarizer in front of a polarized light, you see this sinusoidal variation. So this sinusoidal variation can tell you all the polarization properties. So the peak to peak difference tells you the amount of polarized light in the scene. The phase offset will tell you the angle of polarization, and the DC offset can tell you about the amount of unpolarized light. So if you can capture the sinusoid, we know the polarization properties. And if we just have 4 different polarizer rotations, we can capture the sinusoid. But sequentially capturing polarization is slow. So this is where snapshot polarization cameras come into picture, where the idea is to capture all these 4 components simultaneously instead of sequentially. So if you have an array of polarizers with 4 different orientations, and if you place it in front of the sensor, you can capture all these 4 points on the sinusoid simultaneously, and in a single shot get the polarization property, of course at the cost of spatial resolution. And you can combine these polarizers with RGB filters as well, and capture RGB polarization information. So with this understanding of the usefulness of polarization along with these polarization cameras, we set out and explored two different capture modalities. First, we looked at the case where we want to perform a single shot separation of diffuse and specular of, let's say, dynamic scenes. And to do that, for this case, we consider polarized lighting. In the second case, we tackle the problem of unstructured, unpolarized lighting, and we show that using polarization, you can decompose the surface geometry, reflectance, and even estimate the illumination that was incident by making also use of multi-view cubes. So for the single shot case, we consider a polarized light source, which we shine on a dynamic scene. In this case, the dynamic scene is just this like bunny rotating. And with we capture the raw measurements of this dynamic scene. From these raw measurements, we can demosaic them and capture the figure out the polarization properties of the scene. Now, from these polarization properties, we can separate diffuse and specular. The analytical way of doing this, like the more traditional ways of doing this, involves making two assumptions. First assumption is that the diffuse light is completely unpolarized and that the measurements do not have any sensor saturation. So when we go ahead and apply, use these analytical polarized approaches, we see that the separation is not that great. We see the diffuse part bleeding into specular. You can see that there are the green color bleeding into the specular map here, and you can see some part of specular bleeds into diffuse. And the reason is that the assumptions that analytical approaches make don't always hold true in practice. As we saw before, the diffuse is not completely unpolarized. When the light exits the diffuse surface, it becomes partially polarized, and measurements could have sensor saturation. So this is also evident in the polarization angle. You see that the polarization angle is all flat at the center because this corresponds to the angle of the polarized light source. But around the edges, we see a similar variation of like angle going along a circle from 0 to pi, similar to what we saw in the sphere case. You can think of this apple as being some sort of a distorted sphere, and basically what you're seeing on the sides is essentially the diffuse polarization. So we develop a technique that can faithfully account for diffuse polarization and measurement saturation. And we get much cleaner separation of diffuse and specular with this technique. And our approach is pretty simple. We take a two-step approach. First, we use the physics in the problem to do an analytical separation. And then we sort of try to refine this analytical separation. So when we get the analytical separation, it would have these artifacts. And then we have this trained neural network that would be trained to remove these artifacts and to give you a more physically accurate diffuse and specular, separated diffuse and specular. So these networks are trained on synthetic data corresponding to random 3D shapes and which have a similar polarization properties as the real world examples. So our two-step approach does a good job at removing these artifacts of diffuse leading into specular and vice versa. And we also compare with a naive technique of just like passing everything end to end with a neural network. And we show that this two-step approach of analytical plus neural network refinement is better than doing everything sort of end to end. And of course, this also holds true frame by frame for dynamic scenes. Yeah, so this can give you like a diffuse and specular separation, but what can you do with it? What can you do with the diffuse specular separation? So we showed that for a lot of vision and graphics applications where you're interested in shape and material estimation, this diffuse specular separation could be a useful pre-processing step. So we use this state-of-the-art material estimation network, and which takes in images of like this flake kind of a plastic orange with different lighting. And its job is to estimate the surface normals and the material properties. But it doesn't do a great job at estimating surface normal and material properties. You can see that the surface normals look very flat, and it explains all the orange color on specular, which shouldn't happen for a plastic object. Like only metallic objects seem to have colored specular. As a result, if we do relighting, if we from these material maps, if we relight the object under different lighting, we see that it doesn't look anything like the captured images. So we just make a small change in this network. Rather than taking these images, combined images, we perform a separation and we feed an R separated input of diffuse and specular. So we retrain this network with just a small change, which is that it takes as input the separated diffuse and specular. And with this small change, it does a much better job at estimating surface normals and material properties. You can see that the surface normals look much rounder, and it correctly explains all the colors coming from diffuse. And as a result, if we relight the object under different lighting, it looks more realistic and more closer to the actual capture. So this was all about single shot case. Now, but it did require a polarized lighting. Now, what if we want to do work in the case like such a room lighting where there is no polarization? In this case, we exploit another thing, another cue, which is multi-view information. So as you all know, in the space of multi-view information, neural radiance fields have shown impressive novel view synthesis and 3D geometry. But with the vanilla nerve, the original nerve formulation, it is only measuring the radiance, the RGB intensity of light coming out of the scene. So this intensity is a function of the scene's geometry, material properties, and lighting. So it's very difficult to separate out the lighting or change the material properties from the radiance that you measure. So we looked into what if instead of just capturing RGB images, we capture RGB plus polarization. How does that help? Like, can that help us in separating out, decomposing this radiance and figuring out the material properties and the lighting? And turns out it does help a lot. So we devised this technique Pandora, where as input we give images coming from a polarization camera, which would have not only RGB intensity, but also polarization information for every view. And based on this information, we estimate the surface normals as a sign distance field. We can separate the mixed radiance field into the diffuse radiance field and specular radiance field. And once we have these specular reflections and the surface normals, we can map back these reflections into the environment and even estimate what kind of environment this object was captured in. So you can see that this object was captured in like our office hallway, like room kind of an environment, and you can make out all those like tube lights and walls in the room and whatever. So to me, this final result was the most appealing, because just by looking at human eyes, it is very hard to decipher and separate out and figure out like what kind of room or what environment was this object captured in. But turns out, like especially with polarization information, you can sort of separate out the reflections well, and you can estimate like what environment this object was present in. So the key parts of our overall our pipeline looks similar to typical like nerve works, where you have a bunch of MLPs. The key aspects of our pipeline are, first of all, we use sign distance fields, which can give you an implicit surface representation. And the good thing about sign distance field is you can analytically get the surface normals by derivative. And as we saw before, surface normals are very useful for figuring out polarization information. The other difference is, like, instead of just modeling the final color, we have different MLPs that model the diffuse radiance and specular radiance. So once you have surface normals, diffuse and specular radiance, you can render the polarization properties. So compared to a regular nerve-based formulation where you'll perform volumetric rendering to get the RGB intensity, here you would perform volumetric rendering to obtain the Stokes vector, which would have RGB plus polarization information. And of course, you would have the captured polarization information. So from the raw measurements of polarization camera, you can get the captured Stokes vector. And we define a loss between the captured and rendered Stokes vector to simultaneously train all these networks. So again, like in a typical NUS, you would have render RGB, have the captured RGB, and you would define loss between them to train all these networks. Here we also include polarization into the training. So one more thing that you can do with these diffuse and specular radiance fields is you can combine them in novel ways to change the appearance of the object. For example, you can change the diffuse color without affecting the specular highlights, and you can use the specular part modify the specular part to be coming from a metal instead of a dielectric, and make this object look metallic. So we wanted to test out how much of this is just neural radiance fields or neural networks, and how much of this is actually got to do with polarization. So we did this ablation experiment in which we considered the same network, the same optimization procedure and everything, but in the losses, we disabled the loss coming from polarization. So the networks are just trained on RGB information. And when we do that, it's not like everything spectacularly fails, but what we see is whenever there are ambiguities, whenever it is hard to separate out diffuse and specular, we see that there are artifacts in the reconstruction. For example, we see diffuse texture showing up in surface normals here, and we see that the diffuse leading into specular here, and it's finding it hard to estimate like these small specular highlights. And if the specular and surface normals are bad, that would result in a much poorer illumination estimation, because to estimate the innovation environment, you have to use the surface normal as well as specular radiance information. So as a consequence, the illumination you can estimate, it looks much worse compared to with polarization. So in these two works, I mainly looked at glossy objects, but there is a lot of polarization signal out in the world which could be utilized in solving like new problems. One exciting application could be for transparent and metallic objects, where they have definitely have a very strong polarized signal, and which have been typically challenging for vision kind of tasks. Like here, I'm showing an example of polarization signal of a concave metallic object. So another opportunity is in scattering media. So scattering media tends to affect polarization in very interesting ways. People have used this for example, doing 3D tomography of clouds, and NASA has used this for estimating droplet concentration in the atmosphere and so on. So there is a lot of scope in using this polarization cameras for capturing properties of scattering media. Another interesting property is more related to circular polarization that I didn't touch up much on, but it turns out that a lot of biological tissue show this property of birefringence, which basically says that the polarization, which can alter the polarization of light coming out of these tissues, and which has traditionally been used in like polarized microscopy for imaging these kind of tissues better. So this, the property of light that these tissues change is birefringence, and there are a lot of biological tissues that are birefringent. For generally the materials which are more anisotropic, which are longer in one direction than the other, seems to show this property. For example, collagen fibers as well as skeletal muscle fibers. So there is a lot of scope of like applying these ideas of polarization into biological imaging of these kind of tissues. So before I move on to the next dimension, are there any questions on polarization? Okay, so I can. If there are no questions, I'll move forward. Okay. So next, let's look into multi-view reflections. So reflections can reveal useful information. I'm sure when you would have, while driving, you might have sometimes seen like incoming cars or incoming pedestrians on reflections of cars around you before you actually see them in your line of sight. And being able to extract reflections from to solve crime is a very common plot in many TV series and movies. Like basically by just being able to enhance the scene, you can estimate the reflections.
His glasses.
There's a reflection.
There are like so for these, like for the movie industry, apparently you can just like get a reflection from eyes or glasses and just enhance them, and there you go, you've solved the crime. But turns out handling reflections is much harder than just pressing the enhance button. The reason is because these reflections depend on three things. The reflections are distorted based on the geometry of the reflector. You need to be able to separate out the reflection from the actual color of the object, and it of course depends on the 3D environment around you. So separating out, handling all these unknowns has been challenging. But what we show is, like, if you have multi-view images of these reflections, and if you use all these recent advancements in nerves and neural rendering, you can do a good job at estimating environment from reflection. In particular, we show that if you have glossy objects, you can use multi-view reflections to estimate the environment as a radiance field from these objects, essentially turning this object into a radiance field camera. So, for example, let's look at this globe sitting in a living room. If we capture multiple images of this globe, we see that the reflections have features about the living room, right? Like, for example, the sofa. So we developed this technique Orca, wherein we can estimate the radiance field of the environment that is beyond the field of view of the camera from these reflections. So once you have the radiance field of this environment that's beyond field of view, you can query it in different ways. You can even place a virtual camera where the object was and see how the world looks like from the object's vantage point. So the key ingredients in our technique are as follows. It's a three-step approach. First, we have a neural network that estimates the surface geometry as a signed distance field again, and also estimates the diffuse radiance. Once you know the surface geometry, you can reflect the rays that are hitting onto the surface. So these would be the primary rays that are hitting on the surface, and they would get reflected so into these what we call as virtual rays. And virtual rays is the object sees the world along those virtual rays. So essentially, the object surface is like a sensor, and it's seeing the world along these virtual rays. Of course, if you have a finite pixel size, you don't really have rays, but each pixel is like a cone. So once you have the surface geometry, you can find a mapping from the real cones to these virtual cones. And once you have the virtual cones, we have another network that is queried on these virtual cones to estimate the reflection. So the neural network, first set of neural network estimates the object's surface and geometry, surface geometry and diffuse color, and the other second network estimates how the environment is. So with these two networks, you can explain the overall appearance of the object. And one key contribution is that we model the environment as a 5-dimensional radiance field instead of as a 2D flat map. So for a lot of, for like what we saw in Pandora and for a lot of previous techniques, they assume that the environment is far away from the object, and it is modeled as a flat 2D map. But that does not model the depth-dependent effects in the environment. And it seems to fail when the environment is not really far away. For example, we rendered these images of this Pokeball, and there are multiple Pokemons in front of it. So it's the environment has like a lot of depth variation, and all these objects in the environment are very close to the reflecting object. So in these situations, this assumption that the environment is far away fails, and having a 2D map no longer helps. In this case, you need to have the radiance field that Orca produces have like depth-dependent effects. For example, you can see parallax effect and occlusions in the virtual views that Orca predicts, and you can even estimate the depth map of the environment from reflections. So apart from estimating the beyond field of view environment, being able to estimate modeling this environment as a 5D radiance field also also helps in these AR/VR kind of applications where you want to insert virtual objects into the scene, or when you want to change the material properties of objects. So as I talked about in the motivation, like we can use these reflections on the objects to turn objects into safety mirrors that can help guide us along blind corners and blind turns. And I'm also interested in exploring other non-visible imaging modalities where these reflections are much more prominent. For example, in the case of long wave infrared or thermal, objects appear much more reflective than they do in RGB. And also in the case of radar and radio waves, there is a lot of scope of exploiting the reflections to estimate the environment better. So moving on to the transient aspect. So if you have a scene in which there is some hidden object, just by capturing the image of this wall from a regular camera, what you would see would just be the image of the wall, because as I said before, the direct bounce component of light hitting the wall and coming back would overpower everything else. But if instead of just capturing the intensity of light, if you measure the distribution of intensity with respect to time of flight, we can actually separate out the light coming from this hidden object, because that light would have bounced off the wall, hit the object, again bounce off the wall and come back. So it would have traveled much larger distance. So turns out that capturing these transients is now becoming practical with SPAD sensors. You would even have like SPAD sensors now on iPhones and iPads to capture for LiDAR abilities. Like you see that black circle on your recent iPhone or iPad, that would be a SPAD sensor. So from these SPAD sensors, it's becoming possible to capture these transients. We developed these imaging setups where you can shine lasers at different points on the wall and image different points on the wall using SPAD sensors and get the transients. And from these transients, we can perform 3D reconstruction of objects hidden around the corner. So there has been a lot of work in this space of transients for NLOS. And so I'll just focus on one of our recent work where we exploit transients and shadows together. So apart from reflections, another thing that can reveal useful information is shadows. Like shadows can tell us, give us the shape of objects that are even occluded. For example, in this case, this mannequin is occluded behind this plant. You can't see this mannequin directly. But if you just shine a laser spot on one surface and look at the shadow on the other surface, you can get a distorted shadow of the object. So by shining different laser spots, you can get different shadows and perform 3D reconstruction of objects that's occluded from our line of sight. This is useful, especially in scenarios when navigating through like corridors, tunnels, streets, or forests, where you have these multiple surfaces around around a hidden region. So, but this technique of using shadows has a problem. It typically involves scanning the scene by moving a laser spot on the wall and then capturing the shadow. Once you have these multiple shadows, you can carve out the space. You can perform voxel carving and estimate the 3D shape of the object. But this is very slow because you have to scan the laser spot point by point. So rather than scanning the laser spots one step at a time, what if we shine all the laser spots at once? So what would happen here? Of course, this would be fast because you just need a single measurement. You, instead of like capturing multiple, waiting for the to scan the laser spot. So this would be fast, but the issue is like all the shadows will get mixed up. We don't know which shadow corresponds to which laser spot. So here, to do this unmixing, we rely on transients, rely on time of flight. So even though spatially all these shadows are mixed, it could be that these shadows, different points on the shadows take different time of travel. Because of that, we can unmix these shadows. So instead of just scanning a laser and then looking at the shadows from a regular camera, we shine multiple laser spots on the wall and capture the shadow transient. So not just the intensity of the shadow, but also the time of flight information. And we showed that you can formulate this as a tomography problem. You can write this as a linear formulation. And to do that, we need to isolate the, so for that, we need to consider a hidden region to be voxelized, coming from voxel fields. and we need to look at the contribution for every point in this voxel. So to do that, let's say we consider the scenario where there is no object. There is the hidden space is completely empty, and we get some transients in this configuration. Now, when there is an object present, we would get some transient, which would have the shadow information. So we find the difference between the two and look at what we call as shadow transients. The shadow transients would only have information coming from the occluded object. So by separating out these shadow transients, we show that we can write these shadow transients as a linear function of the voxel occupancy. And once you have this linear tomographic kind of problem, you can perform back projection from these shadow transients and estimate the visual hull or estimate the shape of the object as a voxel field. So we showed that without if you don't have time of flight information, you cannot really multiplex. So when there is without any transients, if you start multiplexing these laser spots, if you have multiple laser spots per measurement, you start losing information because it cannot demultiplex the shadows and unmix them to do a 3D reconstruction. But if you have the transient information, you can multiplex. You can, instead of capturing all the 60 laser spots one at a time, even if you capture 10 measurements by shining 6 laser spots together, you can actually estimate 3D shape. So this sort of concludes the major aspects of my discussion. And overall, I've talked about how we can exploit unique properties of light to overcome challenges in the visual technologies of the future. The challenges we've looked at are like being able to create interactive digital copies of the real world and to be able to see around blind turns and behind occluders. And you looked at how polarization, reflections, and transients are useful properties of light that would help in overcoming these challenges. But there are still roadblocks on the way for wide adoption of these next generation cameras into these future vision technologies. So like the current limitations include, for example, for polarization, it is hard to capture polarization information under low light. And when you have a very high, in that sinusoid, if your DC offset is too high, it is very hard to separate out just the amount of light that is unpolarized. Sorry, if your unpolarized light is too high, it is very hard to separate out the polarized component. Now, for multi-view reflections, again, we don't have the enhance button, so it is hard to. We are always sort of limited by the resolution of the camera, and the reflections might even show up in a very small part. So they often tend to have very low resolution, and they might be muddled by the actual color and texture of the object. With respect to transients, the current transient cameras tend to have low spatial and temporal resolution compared to, let's say, RGB cameras. There are no like 10 megapixel SPAD arrays out there today. But with all these limitations can hopefully be removed in the future. There is a need for developing more robust and efficient sensor and optics to exploit these unique dimensions of light. And there is also a lot of scope on the reconstruction side by developing efficient simulators of these unique properties of light and capturing real world data sets on which we can train data driven reconstruction techniques on. So with this, I would conclude my talk, and I'm happy to take more questions. And if anyone is interested in this particular direction, I'm happy to chat further about any of these works.
Thank you. Before questions, we can maybe give a quick virtual round of applause for Akshat's talk. I see there are some questions in the chat already, but also feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself to ask.
So one question that Rafael has asked is like, do Pandora and Augur consider self-occlusions and surface interreflections? So currently they do not consider self-occlusions and interreflections, and that is a very interesting future prospect. And like I think it's a very interesting problem to solve, because like let's say if you have multiple glossy objects, they would be sort of you would see reflections of one object on the other, and it is challenging to handle this because now you have light undergoing multiple bounces. So being able to handle these multiple bounces in an Earth like setting is still an unsolved problem and seems very useful. Yeah.
We have a question in the chat first, and we can go to Chuda maybe. The question is, could you use compressive sensing for the two bounce non-line of sight when you multiplex the n illuminated points rather than using a SPAD?
Yeah, that's a good point. Maybe like I believe like by using compressive sensing, you mean like can you exploit the sparsity in the scene to be able to demultiplex? I agree that is a useful direction. Like maybe by exploiting sparsity, we can be able to multiplex even without using a SPAD. But yeah, so those are like two different dimensions, like acquisition versus reconstruction. By using ideas from compressive sensing, we can definitely improve reconstruction and multiplex more and more points. Like,
okay, we can go to Chuda and then hop back to the chat.
Okay. Yeah.
Thanks for the talk. The surface normal results when you essentially ablate the polarization information.
Okay.
I guess it's difficult for me to see on the virtual slides the difference because it's the image resolution is not great on my laptop. But do you have any quantitative numbers on? I'm sure it was in the paper, but like, do you have that handy of like roughly how much improvement there is with and without polarization?
So we see that in terms of the metrics, we see very less improvement. But when we actually qualitatively look at the reconstructions, we do see some interesting features. Let me try to pull up that slide again, sir. So I'm not sure how evident this is in Zoom, but one thing that we see is like the high frequency information, like the bumps. Like if you basically there is this owl object has these bumps, and we see that the high frequency information is harder to get from without polarization, because without polarization, it's just relying on multi-view stereo to do some sort of like carving and figure out the geometry. And like with multi-view stereo, you can't get like fine texture and like finer details. So we see that like polarization helps a lot in finer details. Like overall, the without polarization looks slightly jagged, but with polarization, you can clearly make out the bumps, and where the surface is smooth, it's quite smooth. So it's sort of similar to how, so Ashita, in your paper, like work with like polarization plus time of flight, you have shown that with just time of flight, you get like a coarse shape, and polarization helps a lot in getting the finer features. We see something similar with like multi-view stereo plus polarization as well. Yeah.
I guess maybe just one follow-up question, just very quickly, like, do you ever see a degradation? Like, with adding polarization, does it ever make the results worse because of any type of nuisance correlations or associations?
Yeah. So we do see like degradations when there is model mismatch. For example, when there is interreflection. So I don't have the result right now, I think, but like for the diffuse specular separation case, we see that when there are interreflections, like if the object has an ear that is like reflecting on the object, if there are self interreflections, then it's incorrectly using the polarization information. So Yeah, so there is model mismatch. We see artifacts, but again, they can be solved by a better model that accounts for like interreflections, considers multi-bounce polarization information rather than just single bounce. So that's one place where we've seen polarization affect
I see.
things.
Thanks.
Okay, and a question from the chat. How do you measure the transient difference for the non-line of sight problem if the occluded object doesn't move out of the hidden scene?
Yeah, so for a difference, as I said, we need like the empty transient and the occupied transient. You're right. If the object does not move out the scene, we don't measure the empty transient, but we calibrate for it. So if we have if we know the relay surfaces, whatever is in our line of sight, if it is calibrated, we can calibrate out the empty transients. We can estimate what those empty transients would be, and then we can subtract those with the occupied transients to get the shadow transients. But of course, this will have like model mismatch and so on. So that would be like worse than actually measuring out those empty transients.
Just following up on this question. So you're just assuming some kind of physical model to estimate this empty transient,
Yes.
like a
yes.
forward model. Okay.
Yes.
Thanks.
So you know the positions of your laser spots and the imaging spots. So you can estimate like what an actual like transient would look like
Gotcha.
in an
Thanks.
empty case. Yeah.
Okay, maybe we can take a question from Mel since you asked a question previously.
Hey, Akshat. So I was curious about something you said at the very end about challenges in detecting the polarization in high unpolarized background. And I'm curious how you, like, what kind of, like, what did you use to collect the polarization information? And I'm wondering if there is a way to create some sort of a sensor that fuses just like regular CMOS and polarization sensitive pixels that could do background subtraction in silicon. And since, you know, we have all of those pieces of expertise in-house anyway.
So this is a very interesting question. And I feel the issue is even before like the photons, even before silicon. And the issue has got to do with more with boson noise. So basically, if you have a huge diffuse, like huge DC offset because of unpolarized part and a small variation because of polarization, the boson noise that you get is proportional to the intensity of both, right? So even if you like design sensors that are sort of like have zero read noise, have zero like very sensitive, like the issue is because of the boson noise itself. So yeah, I'm not sure how to like what is the best way to handle it, but I'm not sure if sensors are the best way to handle this. So if anyone has any ideas along this space of how can we remove like if we have this kind of a situation where there is like a small signal riding on top of a huge DC offset, what can we do? Yeah.
Okay, maybe we can do a last question from Achuda because we're getting close to one and we still have to do the advice section. But if there are remaining questions, you can definitely reach out to Akshat. I think you should be able to find, or if you're open to that, I think your contact is probably on your website.
Yeah, I would be happy to chat more, especially I'm actively like looking into the opportunities that I discussed about. And if you have any ideas along those opportunities, I would really appreciate them. Happy to chat more.
Just a very quick question on those lines. Just combining some of these other questions a little bit. So with non-line of sight, we have KD's paper on the ICCV, right? Turning corners into cameras, looking at shadows. You're talking about multipath with polarization, which is also looking at non-line of sight. Is there something unique in the shadows that are caused by polarization in the contrast of shadows, especially when you have motion of an object? Because I would think that the shadows would have some different characteristic in the polarization domain. Is that something of interest to look at that?
That is interesting direction. Although, so like one issue with polarization is it gets pretty much destroyed with diffuse, right? So if you're looking at shadows on a diffuse surface, the non-shadow part and the shadow part might have like both would have like very few polarization. But maybe if you have like shadows on a specular surface, those could be useful. Or like if you have like glossy interreflections where you have like shadows falling in on like self-shadowing because of like specular like surface, maybe yeah, like polarization could be useful there. But not sure, but yeah, this is interesting too. Yeah, I've been thinking about like polarization plus shadows, but I don't have any answer or insight into it yet.
Cool. Thanks.
All right, we can move into the advice section now.
Yeah. So yeah, I was just looking at the chat if there's any question. Yeah, I think I did answer them. There's just like one quick question I'll quickly address, which was any degeneracies in and loss, like if different scenes give rise to same set of transients. So like that can be seen from like the from our form model y equals ax. Yes, there could be different scene points which could give rise to the same x. So we need to like rely, which we can get rise to the same measurement. So we don't really need to rely on like prior. So in terms of what I wished I knew in the first year, this is just a mixed bag, just like random stuff. But one thing I wish I knew earlier was that like writing and thinking are closely related. It took me a lot of time to understand that they are not like separate. Like I used to like just think, take a walk, just think about things and not care as much about writing before. But like the more I look into it, the more I'm trying to understand how to write and think in a symbiotic manner, how writing can help my thinking and how my thinking can help my writing. And one thing that had helped me throughout my PhD was trying to find joys in small immediate wins, because like PhD there is like very sparse reward. It's I mean somehow like finding just being joyful, just being able to find some happiness out of like small things seems to help a lot. At least it helps a lot to me. And another advice from others which has helped me is like being able to come up with a lot of ideas, just brainstorming a lot of ideas and then implementing some of them, trying to fail quickly and then trying to finalize on what I want to work on, rather than just like working on all those 100 ideas in parallel, or like just tuning on one idea and just focusing on that. And this, in terms of like choosing good research problems, this is like an advice from Ramesh. Basically, the Hellmeyer's catechism. Trying to answer these questions for any new problem that you might have in mind does help a lot. So, and another like similar hack in terms of like how to choose good problems that I found useful is looking at these at this like pasture quadrant. So like there is like different kind of research which is like corresponding to whether there are like scientific advancements needed, or whether like it's basically more technical skill driven versus application driven. And to me, I sort of realize that I like more to be in the pasture quadrant, where I want to do like technical advancements as well as try to solve a real problem. So like just being able to think about things along these two dimensions, I feel helped me a lot in figuring out what which projects to work on and what to work on in future. And so yeah, that's all that I had in terms of like the things I wish I knew. But if people have like comments on these points, or if they agree or disagree or and so on, please feel free to chime in.
Great, thank you so much for the advice. And let's do one final round of applause for Akshat. Virtual round of applause, as always. I think we are actually all over time. So if there are any remaining questions, definitely feel free to reach out to Akshat. But thank you everyone for joining this month's Grundfest lecture, and hope to see you guys for the upcoming talk, which will be on the website soon. And thank you, Akshat, for the great talk as well.
Yeah, thanks, Ellen, Achyut, and Katie for having me. That's great.
Okay, so I think
Bye.
Akshat, you have access to the one-on-one the spreadsheet, right?
Yes, I think I have a like one-on-one with Rishi, but I'm not sure if there is a Zoom link for, like, is it the same
Oh,
Zoom link
okay.
or by Rishi?
Usually it's a different one. Here, let me check this out. Oh, on my end, it looks like all the
Okay, okay. Yeah, maybe I would
links
have
are okay.
maybe I have been updated. Okay, I'll use those Zoom links. Yeah. Thanks
Okay,
so much.
yeah. Yeah, if there are any issues, email me and let me know.
Yeah,
Okay.
thanks so
Otherwise,
much.
thank you so much. I'll hope to see you around.
Thank you.